One of the most hotly debated topics in discussions about Soviet history is the abandonment of the new economic policy followed by the collectivization of agriculture that the Soviet regime launched in the late 1929. These policies are often discussed with narrow perspectives that don't fully capture their complex implications. Some groups refuse to consider any views that stray from the Bolsheviks' official party line, while others reduce the policy's impacts and hardships to the supposed whims of one absolute dictator. Before we dive in, let me set the stage. If you're expecting a video that will just give you enough data to back up your favorite Communist Party leader, this isn't the kind of content. This also won't be a video that speculates on questions like which faction would Lenin have supported if he was still alive. Instead, I'll be taking a critical look at the actual conditions in the Soviet countryside during the NEP period, exploring the pressing issues, the grain crisis, and how the Communist Party evolved, ultimately leading to the abandonment of the NEP. For this research, I have leaned heavily on two essential sources: Russian Peasants and Soviet Power by Moshe Lewin and Volume 1 of Carr's Foundations of a Planned Economy. Both are invaluable sources for anyone wanting a deeper understanding of Soviet history. Lewin and Carr are must-reads. With that groundwork laid, let's delve into the topic. The October Revolution had given the peasantry land which previously was controlled by the aristocratic landowners. This was a massive leap towards their liberation, but it was far from done. Their condition of livelihood rarely altered. They were still very poor, and only on the 1925 to 26 period did they start living above starvation level and started eating more than they used to before the revolution. Illiteracy was a big problem. At the eve of collectivization, more than 10 years after the revolution, there were 16 million illiterate in the 16 to 35 age group, 30 to 40 million semi-literate in the same age group, and 5 million aged between 12 and 16 were totally illiterate. Not to mention those in the over 35 age group, more than half the peasant population illiterate. Even though the party leaders continuously emphasized the role of education, talking about a cultural revolution, there was not much done about that. The peasant households retained a very archaic structure. The households were ruled over by the father, who was head of the family and organizer of farm work. His position in the household was that of an all-powerful patriarch, as that of the Middle Ages. Any infraction of paternal discipline was severely punished, usually by physical cruelty in the shape of beatings, of sometimes maniacal violence. This element of cruelty, which was a normal feature in the process of upbringing, was also a general feature of peasant life. The violence which used to occur was sadistic and bloody, and oftentimes women and children were beaten. One would expect in that case that a communist regime just established would go about not only combating the landlords but these patriarchal structures which were so common in the peasant households. But unfortunately, here also there was not much attention being paid, owing to the existence of a backward culture. As late as 1928, 5.5 million peasant holdings still used to farm using the wooden plow. They were not open to modern farming methods. The Soviet authorities couldn't force them to adopt to modern methods either. Adding up to all the troubles, the existence of dispersed farming methods was a fatal blow to the whole system. Out of a total of sown area of 257 million hectares, only 85 million hectares had been reallocated in 1929. That was 12 years after the revolution. The party leaders spoke of this issue continuously. They showed their open frustration about it. All of these issues mounted up to produce a great danger. Russia, which was a majorly agricultural country at that time, couldn't risk of a bad harvest. A good harvest was important for the existence of the whole regime itself, or it will risk into letting the country slip into the brink of famine. The Soviet village was an illustration of poverty. The one who suffered most from this were the poor peasants. One peasant woman, an agricultural worker, who was a member of her village Soviet in the Ukraine, reported that their village was situated very far away from the district. "That is why we are so isolated from medical services," she said. "If it's a rich peasant who is ill, he will go in his car, but a bednayak might die before he can get to a doctor." There was no drinking water in the village. "We fetch water from 20 kilometers away." Here again, the better off peasant can transport it on his horse, but the bednayak has to carry it on his back. Another delegate, this time a kolkhoz member, spoke of the peasants of the Nizhny Novgorod circle. "It is my duty to report that in our rayon, peasants were very badly off. In this, the 12th year of the Soviet regime, the peasants are eating substitute bread made with mountain spinach. In such conditions, the local party officials are finding it hard to do any propaganda." Even though the poor peasants were the greatest allies to the Soviet power during the Civil War, they were the least bothered with the long-term goal of the regime. For them, what mattered was their direct benefit, that is, the land. They were not bothered about moving society to a form where there existed no property. At best, their attitude, and it is very much true for the rich and poor peasant alike to the Soviet regime, was that of passivity. They were not opposed to the regime. They had bid away the Tsarist rule for good and didn't want to turn back anymore. The passivity, though, was a result of the negligence of the regime itself. With the NAP, though, as we know, the peasants had got freedom of the market. Because of the peculiarities of market relations, some peasants got better off because of their productivity and the ability to adapt better with changing conditions, and some got worse off, and there was stratification. Hiring wage labor and leasing of land privately was allowed. This led to the growth of many peasant households which started employing the poor peasants and exploited their labor. While this was a necessary step taken by the regime to make the economy stable, because if there is nothing to eat, communism is a far-sighted dream. As we will see, the differentiation was not a static one. The groups overlapped, there was no clear statistic which could provide a strict demarcation of the classes of peasantry, and hence represented another problem. This section will be very important, as it will be on this and the diverging understanding on this matter which will lead to the upcoming conflicts within the party about the continuation of the NEP and collectivization. Even though there were differences inside the party in understanding the stratifications, and many had different models in their mind to classify the peasantry into groups, a general model which was there is a four-class category: agricultural workers, the poor peasants, the middle peasants, and the rich peasants, who were called the kulaks. Hardly from being static, the difference in reality was indeed more dynamic, and hence classifying them in groups often didn't produce a clear understanding. Kritzman, in an article, Criteria for the Study of the Class Structure in the Countryside, quoted the scale of this problem. Not only does almost every peasant work on his farm, but he himself or the members of his family also work outside of it. Or again, he may take on workers, or hire the means of production from someone, or alternatively hire out his own means of production. He borrows or lends, for example, his seed grain. In short, there are practically no cases where a peasant farm manages its production entirely independently, but very often it will nevertheless be managed in substance as an independent farm. Many agricultural workers owned a small farm and also worked as wage laborers by the day, and this was the same case with that of poor peasant. It was difficult to discern the two groups. The poor peasants sowed little and had no horse, and also went to work on nearby farms. It was difficult again to differentiate the poor peasant from the middle peasant. The weaker portion of the middle peasant, which constituted half the population of the middle peasants, also sowed very little, and did not have access to instruments, and also engaged in wage labor to make their ends meet. The difference lied in the possession of horse, but many peasants who were classified in the poor category also had horses. It was difficult to differentiate the strong middle peasant from the kulak. The lines of distinction here again were blurry. The official party researchers held that the kulak were exclusively the class who relied on the exploitation of wage labor, while the middle peasant, strong or weak, didn't, but this was far from reality. The middle peasants, even the weaker ones, were often sometimes employers, and this was very much true for the stronger ones. They hired out their equipments. Moreover, almost half of the peasants who were classified as kulaks did not hire wage labor. Class power was mostly determined by trade and acquisition of agricultural implements. A special commission was set up by the Council of People's Commissars to study fiscal charges, and this included the leading specialists in the field under the chairmanship of Frumkin, the then Commissar of Finance. They produced the following data for the year 1925. Another research was done by Strumlinen in 1926 produced the following results. Data published in the Journal of Gosplan by two research workers in the year 1928 to 29, they arrived at a figure of only 51% of the middle peasant and 30.4% of poor peasant. There was no mention of the agricultural wage laborers who were probably included among the better off peasants. Moreover, 18.6% of the households, including 4.5% of kulaks and 14 to 15% better off, were included in the upper stratum. For Stalin, this stratum represented the crux of all issues. At the end, there was no adequate or accurate survey on class differentiation, even though resources existed. Ivanovich Lyashchenko, who was an economist and a specialist, remarked, "We have no statistical data, however incomplete or approximate, on the evolution of class structure in the Soviet village over any given period of years." In 1927, there were around 2.7 million agricultural laborers. A very small minority of them were employed in the state-owned farms and the cooperatives. Around 1.5 million of them were hired by individual peasants. It is to be noted that the ones who hired them were not by default kulaks. Many of the poor peasants themselves were forced to hire a worker at certain times. Their work times used to vary from 10 to 13 hours a day on average, and they earned no more than half of what the workers employed in the state of farms used to earn. Their condition of life was no better than a slave. It was marked by poverty and destitution. Everything was against them. Even though doctrinally they were the main supporting class of the Soviet regime in the countryside, ironically enough, they were in the lowest rungs in terms of economic and social position. The local authorities, like the People's Tribunal, often sided with the powerful and well-off ones. Even if it sounds paradoxical, this is the reality. The regime was unknowingly rallying under it the class forces of well-off peasants who will become a hindrance to its long-term ambitions. As Lewin states, the gulf between doctrine and reality was very blatantly obvious and weighed heavily on the regime. Heading on to the poor peasants. Here we are dealing in any case with a peasant whose income from his farm is clearly insufficient to support his family, even in a fertile agricultural region. This forces him to seek his means of subsistence in complementary work, and primarily in agricultural wage labor. There were attempts made to differentiate the poor peasants from the agricultural workers. According to a study, the poor peasants differed from workers because they worked no more than 20 to 50 days a year and hired draught animals and implements for more than 10 days per year. According to Strumlinen, a poor peasant differed from an unemployed peasant only in that he was not registered at the unemployment exchange and that he possessed a plot of land which entitled him to be considered a farmer. For the regime, they were of importance because they were the seller of grain and purchaser of manufactured products. On average, they held 20% of the grain reserves. At a plenary session of the Central Committee of the party in 1925, Molotov announced a series of measures to be taken to organize the poor peasants, to help them economically, enlist them in the cooperative movement, but in the very same session the party decided to transform its Poor Peasants Committee into a mere voluntary organization. Here again the contradiction between words and actions is obvious. Following the investigations by the Commissariat of Inspection, Pravda of April 7, 1928 noted a disgraceful disparity between the amount of energy expended in raising funds for the relief of the poor and the use of these funds in practice. But the sum gathered at the cost of so much energy was for the regime 20 million rubles, which was absurdly low. The cooperatives dealt with the sale of agricultural products and the purchase of means of production. The peasant who produced little or nothing at all had little place in the cooperative movement. The credit cooperatives naturally preferred the better-off client and were wary of the poor peasants who had not sufficient means to guarantee repayment of his loan. Thus, according to Lyashenko, only 5.8 to 18.7 of the lower strata benefited from any kind of credit, whereas in the better-off category, 36.1% of households received loans and much larger ones than the poor. The poor peasants received only short-term loans even if he was a member of the cooperative. This was in line with the spirit of the NEP, as Lewin remarked. These were the realities of the poor peasants and the rural workers. The party attitudes politically towards them were that of mere sloganeering at best. In the economic dimensions, very little happened for their upliftment. Their material conditions were becoming worse. The party position on the middle peasants during the NEP period were far from stable. Shifts in the policy used to take place constantly. These shifts started becoming a major during the end years of the NEP. Spashukanish noted in 1926, the poor peasants were being forced into the Soviets by all possible means, and the middle peasants were being thrust aside. The right to vote was being withdrawn indiscriminately, and thousands of complaints from unjustly treated middle peasants were pouring into the electoral committees. These injustices, it was claimed, would be rectified later as far as possible. But certain persons, particularly the middle peasants, the same source stated, are being to feel that the party and the Soviet regime are deliberately excluding them from the direct participation in the government and the control of the state. The threefold formula of alliance, which the party espoused, that is, ally with poor peasants and middle peasants to isolate the kulaks, did not necessarily reflect the reality. All the stresses and strains which arose in the economic life of the country stemmed from the inadequacy of the contribution of middle peasants to agricultural production, and the resultant clashes inevitably resolved themselves into a confrontation between the middle peasant authorities. Because of the ambiguities involved in demarcating them from kulaks, many of the middle peasants could easily be marked as class enemies. As we will see, when the party officially abandoned the NEP and emergency measures were on full flow, the attacks on kulaks was hitting the middle peasants the hardest. Any concession made to wage workers and poor peasants were seen by the middle peasants as discriminatory to their own interests. Moreover, concessions were not necessarily productive in nature. They enabled the poor peasant to eat a little better. But the pressing issue, which was the marketability of grain, was not tackled. As we have discussed, because of the lack of proper statistics, it was essentially hard to determine the exact number of kulak families. This is important, because according to Soviet Alliance formula, the kulak represented the class who endangered the growth of capitalist relations, and hence was deemed as class enemy. Each percentage represented around 1.25 million peasants. Any percentage here and there would mean risking to categorize more than 1 million people as enemies of the state. Yuri Larin estimates the proportion of the strictly capitalist group which constantly hired labor at about 2% of all households, or 450,000 families, at the beginning of 1927. During the 15th Party Congress at the end of that year, Molotov, while insisting that it was an almost impossible task to give an exact estimate of the number of kulaks, nevertheless gave a figure of 3.7%, which for an impossible task was rather too precise. 1 year later, at the November plenum of the Central Committee, Stalin was to speak of the number of kulaks as amounting to 5% of the peasantry. This percentage given by Stalin was at all events widely disputed. At the same time, Gosplan in its calculations for the 5-year plan had adopted a figure of 3.9%, without, however, entering into any discussion about it. Vladimir Milutin had remarked on these ambiguities that there had been no clear, concise definition of the kulak's role in the process of stratification, which was taking place during the NEP. Everyone had a different understanding. Kritzman and his colleague defined hiring out of agricultural equipment to be the main criteria for determining who was a kulak, while for Sukhanov, hiring out of animals or equipment was not a sign of agrarian capitalism, as Kritzman maintained, but an antagonistic relationship, like the relationship between the buyer and the seller, which was not necessarily a class relationship. For Dobrovsky and specialists of the Commissariat of Agriculture, the determining factor was the per sale of labor power and the ownership of means of production, extensive enough to qualify as capital. To Bazarov, the kulak was primarily an usher who continued to flourish in the Soviet conditions and amassed resources which enabled him to indulge in widespread speculation, his activities often being furthered by errors in government policy. While in 1929, when the infamous right opposition were liquidated, the definition provided by Kritzman and his colleague was accepted officially by the Council of People's Commissars. The average kulak, or rather the average peasant classified by the regime as kulak, had little in common with these. Only a minority of them owned 3 to 4 cows and 2 to 3 horses, and it should be remembered that this minority had first of all to be classified as kulak in other respects, since 3 to 4 cows could be found on a farm which in no other sense gave any sign of being kulak. Those of them who employed wage labor employed in the majority of cases only one worker. According to Kritzman, only 1% of the farms employed more than one paid worker. According to tax authorities, 2.5% of the well-off kulaks had an annual income exceeding 700 rubles. The remainder had less. Shumlinin, who considered the proportion of kulaks to be no greater than 3 to 4%, estimated that the kulaks' average earnings were 5 times greater than those of poor peasants, amounting to about 400 rubles of taxable income, while he paid 20 times more in tax per household and 30 more per head. The real conditions diverged from official demarcations, hence the kulaks were not really a special class in themselves, but only an enlarged version of the middle peasants. There were no distinct qualitative characteristics, but only a quantitative one existed. The interests of the middle peasants to that of kulaks were identical. They both wanted more concessions. The kulak had no more value than a scapegoat to the party. They could effectively single him out pursuing emergency measures. An attack on the kulaks was bound to affect the majority of the middle peasants, who represented the real trouble to collectivization. So this was the whole ordeal about the differentiation of the peasantry in class during the NEP and the problems it represented. There was no proper study of this differentiation, hence no proper statistic A mechanical understanding restricted proper policies. While the poor peasants and rural workers, by the logic of the threefold formula of NEP, were the doctrinal heads of the Soviet regime, their social and economic position was not good. They were neglected by the authorities and injustices were done to them. On the matter of middle peasants, the party policy largely vacillated. There was no fixed policy at all. The ambiguity of the term kulak was also there, and many kulaks could well just be middle peasants and the average farmers who weren't actually capitalists. Nonetheless, a struggle against the kulaks also was a struggle against the middle peasants, even if the party doctrines won't admit that. The marketability of grain was an important precondition for the economic revival. This was recognized by the Party Central Committee in 1925 and again in April 1926. In the party, the official line was still very much in favor of continuation of the NEP policies. It was decided upon that a raising and adjustment of taxes and organization of machinery of collection can very well help with the procurement of grain. Peasantry was more prosperous and better satisfied than any time since the revolution. In 1925, the collections had fallen off badly between September and December. In the same months of 1926, they were still rising, and nearly twice as much grain was collected in this quarter as corresponding quarter of 1925. The prices remained generally stable. There was a noticeable increase of 2 million tons of grain compared to previous year. This was similar with wheat and also with rye. Not only had more grain been grown and more brought to the market, but a higher proportion of the marketed grain had flowed into the public sector of the economy through the state and the in 1926 to 27, the proportion reached 77%. Because of this betterment of condition, the official line of the party had got firm ground in attacking the opposition who were critical of the NEP. In Bukharin's estimation, the success of grain collection smashed to atoms the whole philosophy of the economic construction preached by the opposition in the past year. The optimism was so high that party leaders like Bukharin and Rykov had discredited the existence of differentiation among peasantry. The party officials had already declared that they had mastered the grain market, and a sense of total control had soothing effect on them. The problem of extracting the necessary grain from the peasant seemed to have been met by a sound tax policy and by good organization. It could be solved in the same way seeding harvests, as the party believed. This optimistic impression prevailed among the party leaders throughout the year and was invoked to beat off and discredit the attacks of the opposition. Unfortunately, the diagnosis was far from complete. In spite of the outstanding successes of the grain collection, the proportion of marketed grain to total yield was far below the pre-revolutionary level. It should be noted, though, that the opposition which existed to the official line did not want to do away with the NEP. The Soviet economy was facing a blockade from all the major capitalist countries surrounding it, hence foreign capital was out of question. To finance its industrial development, it needed capital-intensive investment, and it could only do so by the help of the peasantry and its increased selling of agricultural products to towns. At the same time, the regime could neither enforce strict taxation policies on them, nor risk underproducing consumer goods for them. It needed to keep the peasants satisfied, so they continued delivering agricultural products, which would finance industrialization. Quite logically at that time, the leaders adhering to the official party line believed that through a policy of increased efficiency and reduced costs, which would produce the necessary accumulations of reserves and without putting excessive pressure on the peasant, industrialization would be possible. Stalin in April 1926 observed that the peasant was the ally of the working class and could not be subjected to fiscal and price policies. At the same time, the leaders of the opposition focused on growing power of the well-off peasants who could very well present a danger to the regime. Throughout 1927, both the majority and the opposition were still conducting the argument within the framework of NEP, which rested on the assumption that while the proletarian state occupied the commanding heights and was the source and owner of the capital invested in the industry, its relation with the peasantry were conducted through the market and the price mechanism, and this meant that the policy must adapt itself to the laws of market and not use administrative methods. We will now see how in the year 1927, A crisis in collection of grain starts to produce a rupture in the official party line. In the August-September period, grain collection starts to fall down, continues to crumble, and reaches at an absolute lowest by December. A chart prepared by Carr about the falling procurement of grain demonstrates it succinctly. The party Central Committee, in its resolution of August 9, 1927, for the first time had named a maximum limitation of the exploiting tendencies of the kulak as a part of policy all-round strengthening of the growth of socialist elements in the whole national economy. The 10th Ukrainian Party Congress, which met in Kharkov at the same time as the Provincial Congress in Moscow, proclaimed that the successful development of agriculture can be achieved only by way of a further development of cooperative and of the collectivization of agriculture, and demanded measures for the systematic limitation of the exploiting ambitions of the kulak. While there was a clear shifting consensus on the problem of acquisition, a general neglect was still present in the leaders about that matter, but not for long. Certain measures were taken to mitigate the crisis. Mikoyan, the People's Commissar for Trade, ordered the high officials of the USSR to send supplies to various regions, including Ukraine, Central Asia, Kazakhstan, Urals, Bashkiria, North Caucasian region, Tamboy, Vorozhnev, Kursk, Sartov, Astrakhan, Crimea, Volgoda, and White Russia. Between 1927 and January 1928, over twice the normal quantity of cotton textiles was sent. However, a slowdown in grain collections was blamed on the inactiveness of the economic apparatus and party organizations. Party workers were sent to key regions to aid in grain collections, including 4,000 provincial and regional workers, 26,000 from districts and rural districts. The Leningrad Regional Party Committee placed 50 party workers at the disposal of the Central Committee for responsible work on grain collections in Siberia and Kazakhstan. Local party committees set up extraordinary grain groups to supervise the collection. The highest party leaders paid personal visits to danger spots. Stalin visited remote rural areas and laid down a plan of campaign, including prosecuting hoarders and distributing 25% of the grain to poor peasants, low price or on long-term credit. The state enforced grain deliveries using administrative weapons, confiscating large quantities or handing them over voluntarily. Article 107, which was the infamous emergency measure, was widely applied, with victims serving as examples. Armored detachments and illegal searches were common. Local sales of grain were prohibited and free markets closed. The extra deliveries were celebrated on Lenin's death and Red Army's anniversary. Quotas were arbitrary, resembling requisitions during War Communism, leading to rumors of the abrogation of the NEP. In the Tyumen department of Siberia, forced collectivization occurred, with dissenting minority members threatened and detained. Belov, in his book The History of Soviet Collective Farm, described violent measures of dekulakization applied in the Ukrainian village in the spring of 1928 by the local committee of poor peasants and the Komsomol. Raids were organized in the course of which not only the grain reserves but all the possessions of 21 kulak farms were confiscated or destroyed. Members of 9 of the households were sent to Siberia or Kazakhstan. Mikoyan, Molotov, Stalin had all justified these measures. To them, a split with middle peasantry was tolerable as long as it fixed the grain crisis. Kubyshev, Kagnovich, all were enthusiastic of the acts and termed the excesses as individual mistakes. A further forcing of the grain collections was called for. The moods of demobilization, which affected some party members after the successes of January and February, must be liquidated, according to them. Rykov and Bukharin, both party leaders, disagreed with the emergency measure. Rykov explained that the difficulties in grain collection could still occur without a kulak in the countryside. He expressed concerns about the shock tactics of the grain acquisition campaigns and had advocated strongly to resort to normal methods. The emergency measures employed by the party, far from solving the crisis, antagonized it more deeply. The emergency measures had produced relatively little grain, and their only result had been a further worsening of the prospects for agriculture. There had again been a decrease in the sowings in 1928, despite efforts to prevent this. Some writers openly affirmed that the emergency measures were partly responsible for the crisis, which had been aggravated by the loss of winter grain in the Ukraine. Once again, this was due partly to natural causes and partly to social factors. During the summer, there had been a recurrence of unfavorable conditions in the Ukraine and North Caucasus, and the harvest in these regions in 1928 was bad. Over the country as a whole, the yield of wheat and rye was smaller than in the preceding year. These disasters were speedily reflected in the numbers of livestock, since the peasants sold off their animals in order to buy seed grain or because they were short of fodder. The negative role of the authorities in all this was clearly underlined by an expert of Commissariat of Trade, who listed as being partly responsible for the fall in livestock production. He said, the fiscal strain, individual levies, and to some extent the tendency for the better off strata of peasantry to avoid inclusion in categories which would place them in disadvantageous class position in the villages. Thus the country was facing the prospect of a shortage of livestock products, in addition to the already existing grain shortage. Stalin's solution to financing heavy industry operations now started to correlate to Preobrazhensky's analysis, who was one of the leaders of the left opposition. In a speech to the Central Committee, Stalin revealed that the Soviet regime had only two resources of accumulation, the working class and the peasants. The peasants were subject to direct taxation by the state, paying too much for manufactured goods and losing on agricultural produce prices. This was a form of tribute or super tax, which the Soviet regime had to impose temporarily to maintain and increase industrial development. There were new commissions attached to the Politburo, which acted as shadow organizations to the government departments led by Rykov. These departments were filled with skeptics, right-wing sympathizers, and liberals who opposed the initiatives of the Secretariat of the Central Committee. Bukharin, Rykov, and Tomsky could now be confronted within the Secretariat, and various matters could have been taken out of their hands. There were hence two Politburos. During the 1928, a group of waverers within the Politburo was more inclined towards Bukharin's views, but were either afraid of the General Secretary or unable to find someone capable of replacing. Politburo was divided during the 1928, and it was not until the end of the year that it was finally taken in hand by Stalin and his supporters. Stalin admitted that practically nothing had been achieved and called for practical measures for improving grain production and state-owned farms and collectives. For Stalin, now there existed only one option to deal with the crisis, that is the forceful collectivization of individual farming to large-scale state-owned farming. Old policies of the NEP had lost relevance, while the existence of a new alliance was often proclaimed by him. It was no more than sloganeering. What was needed was a drastic action. The only solution open to the regime was to modernize agriculture and to go over from small-scale to large-scale farming. By March itself, there were rumors among high-ranked officials about a difference in position about NEP and the uses of emergency measures. Bukharin and Rykov had stressed again and again the importance of maintaining an equilibrium between the various sectors of economy, and were against pressuring the peasantry excessively, which according to them would only harm industrialization in the long run. In June, there was growing criticism of Stalin's policies and a growing determination to oppose him. Moscow Party Secretary Uglanov criticized Stalin's policies, claiming they were based on inadequate statistical data. Slepkov attacked Kirov in Leningrad. Tomsky, the head of the trade union movement, prepared for battle and confirmed a Trotskyist. Stalin referred to Stalin as the carrier of Trotskyism, but realized that Stalin was a greater threat to the country. As compulsory procurements resumed, relations with the peasantry became strained, and relations between Politburo protagonists entered a new phase of tension. Astrov, the editor of Pravda and a supporter of Bukharin, published an article expressing the strongest disapproval of acts of violence which had been committed against the peasants, a fair amount of evidence in support of his statements. He also quoted freely from Bukharin's criticism of these elements within the party, who tended to place undue emphasis on the use of administrative methods and believed it possible to omit necessary stage in the process of development. This was particularly an interesting period in the history of Soviet Union. I plan on making detailed videos in future on the conflicting views of the right opposition as well as the left opposition. Everyone involved in this had some interesting ideas. According to the right opposition, the defective price policy and the faulty planning were behind the crisis. Fixing it will fix the crisis, and there will be no need for emergency measures. Stalin and Kaganovich were still persistent on proving the necessity of emergency measures. Stalin's replies to Tomsky showcases his over-reliance on the usage of terminologies out of context. He was the least concerned in proving why the state-owned farms were inherently superior to deal with the crisis, but rather enforced it on an ad hoc basis. For a realist like Rykov or an economist like Bukharin, the viability of state-owned farms and collectives had been demonstrated neither by experience nor by economic calculation. To rely exclusively on their success was to risk everything in a venture that was doomed to failure according to them. On the 30th September, Bukharin published an important article in Pravda, The Notes of an Economist, which contained an alternative program for a socialist economy. However, its political impact was negligible, as the public and party activists had never seen or understood Stalin's program. Stalin tried to prevent the article from being noticed, and at November's session of the Central Committee, he pretended to have nothing against Bukharin's article. This article triggered a series of powerful blows at the right, including the demolition of Bukharinist strongholds in Moscow in October. Bukharin's ideas of developing a socialist economy would be discussed in greater length in later videos. The trade union organization, led by Tomsky, was severely damaged by Stalin's appointment of political officers, with Tomsky's leadership being taken over by Kaganovich and Shemik. Other officers were also appointed to the editorial board of Pravda to control Bukharin's activities. It took Stalin almost a year and a half to build up his myth of a danger from the right, which played a significant role in domination and terror during the Second Revolution. By November, the anti-right campaign was at its peak, and the press was inflaming public feelings of white heat over an enemy who had not yet been identified. Bukharin and his associates felt that they were being broken without being named, and the noose was tightening around their necks. Bukharin stayed firmly to his stance against the emergency measures which he had declared to be military feudal exploitation of the peasantry. He emphasized on the inefficiencies of the collectives and that it cannot supplant the private sector at the current stage of development, and recommended importing grains which were preferable to emergency measures. On April 7th, in response to the opposition within the Communist Party leadership, Stalin took decisive action to expose and discredit the faction led by Bukharin, Rykov, and Tomsky. He publicly acknowledged their group's existence, labeling it as a right-wing deviationist faction that opposed the party's goal of eliminating capitalist elements in the Soviet society. To justify why he had not yet addressed these internal divisions earlier, Stalin claimed that the party had been unaware of the group's activities. A declaration was prepared for the Central Committee condemning Bukharin's faction, and Stalin followed it with a harsh speech filled with both ideological critiques and personal attacks. Simultaneously, Soviet press campaigns intensified, claiming to delegitimize the faction and suppress dissent within the party. On July 21st, readers of Pravda learned for the first time that Bukharin had been removed from the Comintern. On August 21st, it was announced that it was indeed Bukharin who was the leader of the right-wing deviationists. This marked the end of Bukharin and also the right opposition, who presented the last struggle to Stalin and the majority of the party, which went on to abandon the NEP altogether.
With this, we come to the end of the video as well. Stalin would go about abandoning the NEP altogether and steering the Soviet Union to an entirely different direction, something he himself would have not envisaged in the 1925s. If it was good or bad, I will leave it up to you guys. Don't forget to leave a like if you stick till the end, and don't forget to subscribe for upcoming videos which will be even more interesting. With that being said, goodbye.